Morning. Very good to be with you this morning. We are excited about being here. In a lot of ways, this is like coming home for us. We were only in the Delta for about 5 years, but just really grew to love not only the Delta, but this congregation. And we have so many good friends that have passed through your fellowship. Individuals like Alex Bays and his family, we love them so much, and Mark and Joan Stiles, and then of course Mark and Sheila, we love them very much. Your elders here have always been very special to me, and I've always appreciated their love for truth and the light that you are in this community, and so you're just a very special church to me and my family, and we thank you for the opportunity to be here. Several have asked me, when was the last time? And I don't know specifically the year, but the last time I was here, I had Jake with me, who's now 15, and I believe he was 3 or 4. So it's been about that long. And so it's good to come back and see you again. I'm going to ask you to turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 27. While you are turning, I want to begin by asking this question this morning. And we'll just answer it together. I don't know if this is normally just a lecture type class, or I won't necessarily pause and ask you to. I just a question or even a disagreement. Here's the question. What did Jesus know about the cross before the cross? What did he know? Well, in John chapter 12, remember he said, "Mine hour has come." So he knew the timeline of his. Furthermore, he knew that he would be betrayed, right? And who would do it? That Judas Iscariot would betray him. John chapter 13, verses 18 and 20. He knew the elders and the chief priests and the doctors of the law would be involved in accusing him and his arrest and so forth. Matthew chapter 20, 17 through 19. He knew that all of the disciples would do what? Forsake him, right? He told them that. And we read about that in Matthew chapter 14, verses 27 through 31. And he knew that one of those disciples in particular would deny him how many times? 3 times. And that was Peter, of course. He would suffer many things, be handed over to the Gentiles, that he would be mocked, that he would be spat upon, that he would be flogged or scourged and crucified and raised back to life on the 3rd day. That's very specific, isn't it? And he named every one of those things in Mark chapter 10, verses 32 through 34. Just chasing a rabbit on that one idea for a minute. It's interesting that in Mark chapter 8, Mark chapter 9, Mark chapter 10, Jesus takes his disciples aside and tells them specifically that he's going to be betrayed, arrested, handed over to leaders, that he's going to be scourged, that he's going to be crucified, and that he's going to be brought back to life, raised from the dead on the 3rd day. 3 times at least. And so here's my question. Why wasn't one of those men at the grave come Sunday morning waiting for him to come forth? They had seen him multiply the food, right? The loaves and the fishes. Not once, but at least twice. They had seen him walk on water. They had seen him speak to nature and it obey him. They had watched him cast demons out. They had watched him make the lame to walk, the deaf to hear, the blind to see. And they were there when he said, "Lazarus, come forth." And they watched that man who had been dead for 4 days walk out of. Where were they on Sunday morning when Jesus rose from the dead? Having told them that over and over and over again. And yet he knew they wouldn't be, right? So he knew that before he was ever betrayed and arrested, crucified. He knew all of that. He knew that it would happen in Jerusalem, Matthew chapter 16, 21. He knew what would happen to his disciples after his death, John chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. He knew what his death would accomplish. in providing salvation for the world. Matthew 26 through 29, John 14, 25. And he knew that he would return to his Father in heaven, John 14, 1 through 4. That he would ascend, that he would take the throne over his kingdom. He knew all of that before he was betrayed, arrested, scourged, crucified. So here's my question, follow-up question. Given that he knew all of this about the cross before he ever went to the cross, why about the 9th hour did Jesus cry from the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why did he ask that question? Did he not know the answer? The question itself, sometimes we get bogged down in this disagreement. Was he forsaken or not? The question itself implies he was indeed forsaken by his Father in heaven. Agreed? You don't ask that if you're not, right? If you're Jesus. And the word forsake means to leave behind, to desert, to abandon. And he was. God did not abandon Jesus in Hades or death. King James says hell. Acts chapter 2, 29 through 33. Meaning he didn't leave him there. He brought him back, right? On the third day. But he did forsake, abandon Jesus while he was dying. The Father left his Son on the cross. There's no denying that. And let me suggest that John 3:16 is the Father's perspective. It's the answer to Jesus' question in Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. My God, why have you forsaken me? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life, right? That's the answer to the question that's asked by Jesus. Recently, I read of a mother who would not leave her child behind in a house fire. He was too big for her to carry, and yet he was physically unable to walk out himself. And she could be heard over her phone comforting her child while the fires consumed them both. She could have gotten away, but she would not leave her child to die alone. She was not going to abandon him, right? She wouldn't, and there's not a mother here, right, that would forsake her child. I read about two brothers who went missing while they were playing, and the rescue team finally found one of the brothers buried in a sandbog up to his neck. And so as they began to get a rope ladder out to him to rescue him from this sandbog before he finally disappeared and suffocated to death, they were asking him, "Where is your brother? Where is your brother?" And he said, "I'm standing on his shoulders." His brother had gone in that sandbog after him and allowed his younger brother to stand on his shoulders so that his life might be saved. He was not going to abandon him. He was not going to leave him or forsake him. But the Father did. He abandoned his Son on the cross. He could have rescued him, he didn't. He could have delivered him, he didn't. He could have saved his Son, but he didn't. Now I want you to think for just a moment about how that must have felt from Jesus' perspective. There's not that Jesus is surprised. I don't think he's surprised at all. He knows it's going to happen, and yet he still asks the question. That he loved and cared for, forsaken by the Gentiles that he had come to save, the Romans, forsaken by justice, Pilate, find no fault in this man, crucifying. One of the most odd judicial sentences of all time, if not the most. Wouldn't you agree? I find no guilt in this man. I sentence him to death. Forsaken by justice, forsaken by the disciples, even those to whom he was closest, forsaken by his own brothers in the flesh. They hadn't believed in him. But most painfully, wouldn't you think? most painfully forsaken by his Father in his greatest hour of need. And that takes our minds back. If you'll turn in your Bibles there with me, you might keep your finger in Matthew 27. Genesis chapter 22, we'll begin reading in verse 1. Will there be a warning bell? There is. 5 minutes, okay. Genesis 22, verse 1. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested him and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young and Isaac's son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off, and Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, son. Then he said, Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Why did he bind him? Would Isaac have put up a fight? I think maybe so. Maybe tried to run. Maybe Abraham just didn't know what Isaac would do. Jacob, you would run, right? I think you would. Most of us would, I think. But he bound him and placed Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Isaac is a type of Christ, Paul says in Romans chapter 9. And we can see how that's the case in many different ways. Both involve a miraculous conception, right? They're different, but with both a miracle. Both are said to be their father's only begotten son. That use of the word monogenes, a very special relationship existed there. Both are sons of promise. Just as Isaac was a son of promise, Christ, the Son of God, is a son of promise. Were offered by their fathers. Did Abraham offer Isaac? He did, but God stayed his hand, right? And God the Father offered this. And for both, at the point of sacrifice, is the hope. You wouldn't learn this from Genesis, but you learn this from the writer of Hebrews in chapter 11. For both Isaac and for Jesus, for Abraham and for God the Father, the hope at the point of sacrifice is the resurrection. It's fascinating because as far as we know, Abraham had never heard of a resurrection, never seen a resurrection, wasn't told by God there would be a resurrection of Isaac, and yet the writer of Hebrews says he put it all together in his mind. God said, it's through this boy that I'm going to keep all the promises he made to me. He's going to make of me many nations. The whole world's going to be blessed. They're going to be numbered as the sand. All of these great promises, and they're going to be fulfilled in him. Now God's telling me to kill him, Isaac, my son. Okay, God always keeps his word. All of these promises are going to be fulfilled in Isaac. Now he's telling me to kill him, where the only way that God's going to keep this promise is if I sacrifice him, God will raise him back up. So he was ready to do it. What faith, right? So, for both of them, there is hope in a resurrection. Jesus was offered by his Father. He was left there, and it wasn't that God did not do anything about it, but he actually turned away from his Son, and darkness lasted for 3 hours from the 6th to the 9th hour. Jesus said to the leaders of the Jews, when I was daily with you, I in the temple, you stretched forth no hands against me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. Luke 22:53. God turned the lights off, if you will. Turned away from His Son, as it were, just looked away and left Him there. My God, why have you forsaken me? Another question. Why did Jesus ask why? Why did He ask? Can you cite another instance in the Bible when Jesus asked a question to which He did not know the answer? I'm not saying there isn't one, but can you come up? Anybody? Another time when Jesus asked a question and He didn't know the answer to that question. Can you remember a time that God asked a question and didn't know the answer? Even in the garden when He said, if it be possible, speaking to God, let this cup pass from me. Did He not know the answer? Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. He did know the answer. The literal rendering there is amazing. God of me, why me? That's what He's asking on the cross. My God, why me? But He knew why. Have you ever asked God, why me? Have you? Why did you ask that question? Why did you ask God, why me? When I ask that question, I've asked that question because I feel not just singled out, but perhaps left out, abandoned. Whether I am or not, I feel that way. Tell me you haven't felt that way. Maybe there's a side of you that says, I know I'm not, but I still feel this way. Have you ever felt like that? And I need to remember during those times, you need to remember during those times of pain and heartache and heartbreak and loneliness and feelings of abandonment, you need to remember, we need to remember this. Jesus knows how that feels. And He in turn has promised us, I will never leave you or forsake you. It happened to Him. And He says, I'll never do that to you. Why did He ask the question? When God asks a question, it's because He wants us to consider the question and answer it ourselves, right? When God asked Adam and Eve, what have you done? Did He know? He knew exactly what Adam and Eve had done. After Cain had murdered his brother, Abel, and God says to Cain in essence, what have you done? Did He know what Cain had done? Oh yes, He had. In fact, He had already lined up Cain's punishment, right? To Elijah, when Elijah's so down and in gloom and despair and depressed, and God asks Elijah, why are you here? What are you doing? Does He know why? Sure, but He wants Elijah to recognize that himself, to question himself and formulate an answer. An answer that God already knew. To Jonah, He says, is it good for you to be angry, Jonah? Jonah says, you better believe it's good for me to be angry. Well, God knew it wasn't good for Jonah to be angry, but He wanted Jonah to realize it wasn't good for him to be angry, so He asked him the question, right? By asking the question, my God, why me? Why have you forsaken me? What does Jesus force the hearers at the time, and you and I today, and so many who did this over the last 2,000 years, what does He force upon us? He forces us to ask, well, why did God forsake him? Right? That's what He's doing. He's forcing us to ask the question. And so I ask, well, why? Why? And the answer, of course, is because of me, for you. God forsook Jesus because He picked you over His Son. Picked you over His Son. Picked me over His Son. Everybody in this room, He picked us over His Son. Right? He did. Growing up on the playground, remember those times, guys, when you divide up and say you're getting ready for a kickball game, and for sake of time, we just select two captains. And you get a pick, and then this captain gets a pick. You get a pick, and this captain gets a pick. Were you ever the last one standing there? That's a lonely feeling, isn't it? A very lonely feeling. Because you didn't get picked, or you were picked by a process of elimination. You're just the last one, right? You end up on this team. Isn't it great God didn't do that to us? All at once, all at the same time. He looked at the world, all those that existed, had lived before and would come, that's you and me, and He saw His Son and said, I'll pick everybody. Lyman Abbott, he wrote this, but I wrote this, I copied it down, and I want to read it to you. He wrote this in reference to the torment of the crucifixion. He says, the sufferer was usually bound upon the cross as he lay upon the ground. The hands and feet were firmly nailed to the wood. Unless the fasting should prove too frail, a transverse piece of wood just below the thigh afforded additional support. The cross was then elevated with the sufferer already upon it and fastened firmly in the ground. In this act, the body would be terribly wrenched. The concussion often dislocated limbs. The victim was left to die. The hot rays of an oriental sun beat down upon his naked body, an unsheltered head. The ragged edges of his undressed wounds, festered and inflamed. From these wounds, shooting pains ran along the exhilarating ways of an excruciating anguish. Every attempt to secure any relief from the unnaturally constrained position increased the torment. The blood was impeded in its circulation. It flowed in a slackened and laborious current. An increasing fever consumed the body with internal fire. The head throbbed in anguish. The parched lips burned with a raging thirst. My God, why have you forsaken me? To remember his other saying, I thirst. He was the water of life, and he died thirsty. His lips burned with a raging thirst. As death drew nigh, insects swarmed upon the body, and birds of prey commenced to feast upon it before life was yet extinct. Yet no vital organ was touched directly. And the stubborn life surrendered to its foe only after a long, protracted siege. Even the pitiless Roman endured not long the sight of suffering that once so protracted and intense. A thrust with a spear or a blow with a club at length put an end to the tortures which wearied even the patience of spectators. You've heard that when they broke the legs of thieves, one to the left, one to the right of Jesus, it was to keep those men from pushing up off their lungs. The man that was crucified was able to inhale, but as his body fatigued, it became more and more difficult for him to exhale. And by breaking the legs, he was unable to exhale at all. He would just collapse on his lungs, and that would hasten his death via asphyxiation. But they came to Jesus, and prophecy was fulfilled. Not a bone of his body was broken, right? He was dead already, but just to make sure, that Roman soldier thrust with his spear, it would have been a death blow had Jesus not already been dead. It was to the heart, and out came blood and water. Blood shed for you and me. And why? In Isaiah chapter 62, verse 2, there was this forecast. God's people were going to be given, do you remember? A new, you say it with me, a new what? Not everything is supposed to be done decently in order. No loud, come on folks, what was he going to give us? A new name, right? A new name. And in Acts chapter 4, Peter is preaching and he says, "Nor is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved." A new name. And there's no other name under heaven by which we can be saved. And Peter was talking about whom? Christ. And then we read that the Christians or the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. And folks, we get to wear that name. Look at the cost. Look at the cost involved. Jesus looked at his son in torment and turned away from him, forsook him. And Jesus felt that abandonment. And it was all about God providing the ability for you and I to be a family, to wear the name of his son, to be called Christians. Look at how much it cost God for us to wear that name. And so that underpins, if you will, the theme for the lessons this week. When we think about this name Christian, we should never take that for granted. We should never forget how much it cost in order to wear it. What a privilege. And with that privilege, what great responsibilities come. God gave up so much just so I could look at you and call you brother, sister. And you could do the same with me. And we have Jesus as our elder brother. And God is our Father. And we are a part of the Christian family. We're Christians. What a privilege.